A Roman emperor was held down on the stones where his mother had given birth to him, and a blade was heated above his face. The room was the Porphyra, the purple chamber of the great palace of Constantinople, faced in slabs of Egyptian porphyry, the color of dried blood, the room in which imperial children were laid down to be born. 26 years earlier, on the 14th of January 771, a screaming infant had been placed on this floor. By right of that birth, by the only law the Byzantine court still respected, without question, he was Roman emperor, sole and lawful. He had been born, as the chroniclers wrote of such children, in the purple. On the afternoon of the 15th of August 797, Theophanes counts it as the 7th hour of the day, Constantine VI was dragged into that same room by armed men. The doors were the same. The porphyry was the same. The light through the high window fell on the same patch of floor where his mother had given birth to him. A blade was heated. A small golden basin of water was brought by the eunuch Aetios. The chroniclers preserved the detail of the basin, and modern historians have argued over it ever since. Treadgold sees a deliberate echo of baptism. Garland is more cautious. But the basin is there in the source, plain, on the floor of the purple chamber. What followed took less time than a sermon. Constantine VI, the only living male descendant of the Isaurian dynasty, was 26 years old. The order had been given by his mother. He had been born in this room. He died of what was done to him in this room. The chronicle has it that for the next 17 days, in Constantinople, the sun did not rise straight in the sky. This is the story of how a woman from a small Athenian house climbed, over 30 years, to the throne of the Roman Empire, and then, when her son tried to take it from her, blinded him in the same room where she had given birth to him. It is the story of a precedent that would haunt Byzantine succession for the next 4 centuries. Every emperor blinded by a relative, from Romanos IV Diogenes to Isaac II Angelos, walked the road that opens here. Theophanes the Confessor, who is our main source for the event, was a monk. He wrote his Chronographia in the early 800s, less than 30 years after these things happened, with men still alive in the monasteries of Bithynia who had seen Constantine's body carried out. Theophanes liked Irene. She had restored the icons at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, and for the monks who had been beaten and exiled by her father-in-law, she was a kind of saint. So when he describes what happened in the Porphyra, he is doing something difficult. He is admitting that the woman the monasteries loved did this thing. I read the passage 3 times before I noticed what he does not say. He does not name the men who held Constantine down. He does not name the cut. He gives us the time, the 7th hour, and the place, the Porphyra, and the consequence. The sun was darkened for 17 days, so that ships went off course and ran aground. He gives us a sky. He does not give us a face. The faces Theophanes leaves out. There is a basin of water in his account, gold, brought by a eunuch. I think he leaves that detail in for the reader who is paying attention. The eunuch was Aetios. We will meet him again. By the end of this story, he will be one of the most powerful men in the empire. Patricios, strategos of the Anatolic theme, consul in everything but the name. In the Porphyra on this August afternoon, he is a servant carrying a basin. 5 years from this moment, he will be governing 2 themes and quarrelling with another eunuch over who gets to choose the next emperor. Watch him. If the period interests you, the chronicles, the maps, the small palace decisions that lost provinces and built dynasties, this is the work the channel does, slowly, 1 episode at a time. There is more of it waiting. Back to the room before the sun goes dark. To understand why a mother gave that order, you have to go back to the night Constantine VI was born. You have to go back further than that. You have to start in Athens, in a house we do not have the address of, in the year 769, when a young woman with no imperial blood whatsoever was summoned to Constantinople to marry the heir to the throne. You have to start with how the Roman Empire, in the middle of the 8th century, came to choose a bride from a city that was, by then, a backwater of cracked marble and dying olive groves. Because everything that happened in the Porphyra on the 15th of August 797 was decided, in one way, by the choices of a woman who arrived in the capital 28 years earlier with nothing but a face the court had not seen before. She arrived as a bride. She did not stay one. A messenger from the sacred palace was a frightening thing to see on the road south from Thessaloniki in the autumn of 769. The horsemen wore the red wool cloaks of the imperial cursus publicus and carried sealed orders that no provincial governor was allowed to open. They rode in relay, changing horses at the official mansiones, sleeping 4 hours at a time. From Constantinople to Athens, by the land route along the Via Egnatia and then south through Thessaly, was 19 days for a fast courier. They did it that autumn in 12. The orders they carried were brief. Find a woman called Irene, of the family of the Sarantapechos. Bring her to the capital. The emperor of the Romans had chosen her. Athens in 769 was not the city the chroniclers like to remember. The Parthenon was a church dedicated to the Mother of God. The agora was rubble grown over with thistle. The population had collapsed to a few thousand. There were 2 ways to make a living in the place: olive oil and the kind of low-level provincial administration that paid in food rather than coin. The Sarantapechos were one of the better families. They had landed property somewhere between Athens and Thebes, and they had produced at least one minor official under the previous emperor. They were not aristocracy. They were not even what a Constantinopolitan would have called gentry. The girl was somewhere between 16 and 19. The sources do not agree on her age. Theophanes calls her young, the other accounts let her be older. She had no family in the capital, no military connection, no link to the iconoclast officer corps that had dominated the court for 2 generations. She had a face, and the empress mother had heard about it. The empress mother was, by 769, the empire's chief talent scout for imperial brides. Her name does not survive in clean form, and that is not an accident. She had been chosen for Constantine V by a similar search 4 decades earlier. She knew how the search worked. The criteria were precise. The bride should be a virgin, of legitimate birth, of unremarkable family, no rival dynasty hiding inside the marriage, and of striking enough appearance that the court chroniclers, who would describe her at every imperial procession for the next 50 years, would have something usable to write. Athens, in this calculation, was nearly perfect. It had a Greek name. It had no military. It had families like the Sarantapechos. Irene was sent for in the autumn of 769. She reached Constantinople by sea, through the Hellespont, in the early winter, and was married to Leo, the son and heir of Constantine V, on the 17th of December that year. She was crowned Augusta at the same ceremony. She had not yet been in the city for a month. She arrived as a bride. Within 11 years, she was a widow. Within 28, she was the woman in the porphyry room. The first thing she had to learn was how to read the court without being read by it. The court of Constantine V was the most dangerous in 3 centuries. He had been on the throne since 741. He was an iconoclast, by which the sources mean that he believed the worship of images was idolatry and that monasteries were full of idolatrous men. He had broken icons all over the empire. He had paraded monks down the Mise, the central avenue of Constantinople, hand in hand with the prostitutes from the city's brothels, to mock the celibacy of their vows. He had burned the relics of Saint Euphemia at Chalcedon. He had blinded officers he suspected of sympathy for the monks. Theophanes calls him Kopronimos, dung-named, because the chroniclers wrote that he had soiled the baptismal font as an infant and the name stuck. By the time Irene reached the palace, the iconoclast emperors had been in power for half a century, and the iconodule party, the people who wanted to bring icons back, had learned to keep their mouths closed. Irene, the chroniclers later claimed, was a secret iconodule. We do not know whether this was true at the time, or whether she discovered her preference for icons later when it became politically useful. What is certain is that she was discreet. For 11 years, while Constantine V ruled, and then while her husband Leo IV ruled after him, she revealed nothing. She gave birth to one son, Constantine, on the 14th of January 771. The boy had been born in the porphyry room, born in the purple, as the chroniclers wrote of such children, which gave him a legal claim no rival could match. And she waited. Leo IV had inherited the iconoclast policy and pursued it without his father's enthusiasm. He was a colder man, less violent, more careful with money. He died on the 8th of September 780 of a violent fever that the chroniclers do not name with confidence. Possibly a kidney complaint, possibly tuberculosis, the sources differ. The rumour at the time, repeated by Theophanes, was that he had taken to wearing a gem-encrusted iconoclast crown from the Hagia Sophia treasury and had been struck down for the sacrilege. He was 31. His son Constantine VI was 9. Irene was about 30, and she was, by the testament Leo left, regent for her child. She moved within 6 weeks. By the end of October 780, she had crushed a conspiracy of 5 Caesars, Leo's half-brothers, all of them adult, all of them more obviously qualified to rule than a 9-year-old boy, by forcing them into holy orders and parading them as priests at the Christmas liturgy in the Hagia Sophia. They were now, by canon law, ineligible for the throne. By the end of 781, she had purged the iconoclast officers from the tagmata, the central guard regiments. By 784, she had appointed a new patriarch, Tarasios, a layman from her own chancery, who would do what she told him. In 787, she summoned the Second Council of Nicaea, which restored the veneration of icons across the empire and declared the iconoclast emperors heretics. For the monks of Bithynia, this was a resurrection. For the iconoclast army, it was a betrayal. Theophanes loves her in these years. So do most of the modern accounts that came down through the monastery libraries. Treadgold, more cautious, writes that she had calculated everything by 781. The patriarch, the council, the army purge, the marriage of her son, the suppression of the Caesars, and that the religious restoration was only one move in a much larger campaign for sole rule. Garland goes further. She points out that Irene, almost alone in the imperial archive, would in time use a Greek title that no woman before her had used in the Eastern Roman record. Not only Basilissa or Augusta, but Basileus. The masculine ending, the title of the emperor, on certain decrees and on the Western diplomatic formulas, as if the throne could be hers alone in her own right. No woman before her had tried it. She did not try it openly while Constantine was a child. She was patient. She let him grow. Constantine VI came of age in 790. He was 19. By the law of his grandfather, he should have been ruling for 2 years already. By the practice of his mother, he had ruled for none. He was a quiet boy, the sources agree, with his father's coldness and none of his grandfather's violence. He had been raised inside a court of women and eunuchs, drilled in the litany of the iconodule restoration, told from childhood that his mother had saved the empire. He did not know any other story. When the iconoclast officers of the Armeniac theme, the great military district that anchored the empire's eastern frontier, mutinied in the summer of 790 and demanded that Constantine rule in his own name, the boy was as surprised as anyone. The mutiny was led by an officer called Alexios Moselle. He had served under Constantine V. He hated Irene, He marched on Constantinople with the Armeniac tagmata at his back and proclaimed Constantine VI sole emperor. Irene, for the first time in 10 years, lost control of the army. She agreed to step down. She withdrew to the Eleutherios palace at the edge of the city. Moselle was made patrikios. Constantine, age 19, sat on the throne for the first time as a man and not as a child. He ruled for 16 months. He did almost nothing in those 16 months that was not undone within a year of his death. He marched on the Bulgars in the summer of 791 and was beaten back at the pass of Markelli. He marched again in 792 and was beaten worse. The boy could not command. He gave orders that contradicted his general's advice. He retreated when he should have stood. The Chronicle of Theophanes does not name the day Markelli broke, and modern scholars argue still over the count of the dead. Some say 4,000, others say twice that. The manuscripts disagree. What is not disputed is that the army that came back to Constantinople in the autumn of 792 was a smaller army than the one that had marched out, and the boy emperor's prestige had collapsed. This is the place to slow down, because something happened in the city in those weeks that the chronicles record as politics and the human heart records as something else. Irene received news of Markelli in late August. The losses fell, the chroniclers say briefly, on the household of the Sarantapechoi too. A younger kinsman of Irene's, of an age to be in the campaign, was among the dead. The chronicle does not give us his role or the day. What the chronicle gives us is that the boy was about 16, and that he was her sister's son, and that his body was brought back to the capital on a cart in early September. The cart reached the Carizian gate. Irene went down to meet it. The sources do not tell us what she did then. Theophanes is silent on the women's quarters. The later chroniclers, Skylitzes among them, were not interested in the burials of minor kinsmen. We have the body, and we have the cart, and we have the autumn weather, and we have an empress walking down the Mise in the colour she wore for the dead. The rest is the kind of thing the monks did not write down, and the kind of thing one is allowed, perhaps, to imagine. A woman, in private, doing the work that the household women would have done if the household women had been allowed near it. 5 years later, the same household would see a different basin carried into a different room. By the end of that same autumn, with the boy still unburied a week, she had drafted the first of the decrees that would, over the following 4 years, undo every concession she had made to her son. She wrote to the strategos of the Anatolic theme. She wrote to the patriarch Tarasios. She wrote to the eunuchs of the cubiculum. Theophanes, who liked her, does not give us the text of these letters. He gives us only the count. 17 decrees in 7 weeks, a campaign in the dark. The mother who had washed her sister's son was now writing letters that would, in slow stages, isolate her own son until there was nothing under him but the floor. In 793, Constantine had Mosul arrested and blinded on Irene's suggestion, the first blinding of the reign. It was meant to settle the Armeniac mutiny. It did the opposite. The Armeniacs revolted again in the spring. Constantine marched against them, captured 1,000 prisoners, and had them branded on the face with the words, Armeniac plotter. The branding alienated every iconoclast officer in the army. The blinding of Mosul had already alienated the iconodule party, who had loved Mosul's iconoclast competence. The boy, in one season, lost both wings of his own coalition. Then came the Moechian controversy. The Greek word moikeia means adultery. In January 795, Constantine repudiated his wife, Maria of Amnia in Paphlagonia, Armenian by her mother's descent, granddaughter of Philaretos the almsgiver, whom Irene had chosen for him in 788. He claimed she had tried to poison him. Some sources say he was telling the truth, others that he wanted to be rid of her. He sent her to a monastery. In September of the same year, he married a lady-in-waiting of his mother's household, a girl called Theodote. Theodote was his second cousin, which made the marriage canonically irregular, and she was Irene's lady, which meant that she was at her mother-in-law's beck and call every day of the marriage. The patriarch Tarasios, Irene's man, refused to perform the ceremony. A different priest, Joseph of Cathara, performed it. The monasteries erupted. The monks Plato of Sakudion and his nephew Theodore the Studite, the most influential abbots in the empire, denounced the marriage from the pulpit and refused communion to the emperor and to the priest who had married him. The party of the icons, the same party that had risen under Irene, turned on the emperor she had pretended to crown. By the spring of 797, Constantine VI was alone. His first wife was in a monastery. His new wife was his mother's spy. His iconoclast army hated him for the brand and blind. His iconodual monks hated him for the divorce. His mother had been writing letters for 5 years, and the eunuch Aetios, the same Aetios who had carried no basin, only a tray of papers, into the imperial chancery for the past 3 years, had been promoted, on Irene's recommendation, to the office of patrikios. The boy emperor had one sense left that something was coming. In the early summer of 797, he stopped eating in the palace. He took his meals in a smaller residence on the Golden Horn, with 2 friends from his iconoclast guard. He slept badly. The chroniclers do not preserve his words from this period. Theophanes does not record any speech of his after January, and I think there is a reason for the silence. By June, by every account that survives, Constantine VI was a man waiting. He decided to run in late July. There was a ship in the harbour of the Bucolian Palace, a small dromon kept ready for the emperor's pleasure use. He intended to take it across the Bosporus to the Anatolian shore, ride south through the Opsikion theme, and reach the iconoclast armies of the east before his mother understood he was gone. The strategos of the Anatolic theme was a man called Nikephoros, and Nikephoros, the iconoclast officers believed, would back the legitimate Porphyrogenitos against a regent mother who had run out of welcome. If Constantine could reach Anatolia, he had an army. If he could not, he had nothing. He had to trust someone with the plan. He chose his own logothete of the Dromos, the head of the imperial post and courier service, a man called Stauracius. Stauracius had been Irene's chief minister for the better part of her regency. Stauracius had been the architect of the 17 decrees in 7 weeks. Stauracius was, by 797, the second most powerful man in the empire after Aetios, and the second most loyal man to Irene after no one. Constantine, who had grown up in the palace and should have known what Stauracius was, told him the plan. By the time Constantine reached the Dromon in the dark before dawn on the 14th of August, 797, the men waiting on the deck were not his iconoclast officers. They were Stauracius's men. He was put under arrest at the oars of his own escape vessel. He was rowed back to the city, not to the Bucolian, but to the great palace landing stage at the foot of the Mise. He was led up the marble steps in the early light of the 15th of August, 797. At the top of the steps, a small chamber opened to the southeast. It was faced in slabs of porphyry, the colour of dried blood. He had been born there. The doors closed behind him. To understand what happened in the 7th hour of that day, you have to understand that nothing about it had been decided in haste. The doors had been chosen the night before. The men had been chosen weeks before. The room had been chosen, by Theophanes' implication and by the modern reading of Treadgold, the moment Stauracius had reported, in mid-July, that the boy was planning to run. There were 6 men inside the porphyra at the 7th hour of the 15th of August, 797. The chronicler names none of them by face. He gives us their offices. 2 officers from the Tagmata, men who had been brought into the regiment after the purges of 793 and 794, and who therefore owed their commissions to Irene and to no one else. The eunuch Aetios. A second eunuch, unnamed in Theophanes, named in Zonaras 3 centuries later as a chamberlain called Niketas, a common enough name in this generation of the palace, and Zonaras writes long after the fact, so the choice of name may be his. A surgeon, a priest, brought in for what nobody at the time was willing to call last rites. The boy was 26. He had grown into a stocky, dark-haired man with his father's heavy features and his grandfather's wide jaw. He had been a soldier of a kind in the Bulgarian campaigns. He had a sword scar across his left forearm from Markelli. He was not weak. The chronicler's silence on the manner of his subduing is not the silence of a quick struggle. It is the silence of a man writing about something he did not want to see clearly. They held him on the porphyry. The chronicler does not say in what posture. The medical procedure for what the Byzantines called seichitas politica, political blinding, was by the late 8th century formalized. Paul of Aegina, the great surgical writer of 120 years earlier, had described in Book 6 of his epitome a procedure for the punitive blinding of a convict, in which a thin iron rod was heated, brought close to the open eye, and held there for the space of 3 breaths without piercing the cornea. The intent of the medical procedure, when done as Paul described, was to scar the lens and the retina without entering the skull. Convicts so treated frequently lived. Justinian II had survived a comparable Byzantine mutilation by Leontius in 695, the cutting of his nose, which gave him the nickname Rhinot Metos, and reclaimed his throne 10 years later. There are other cases in the chronicles, blindings under the late Heraclian and Isaurian emperors, that the men survived for years afterwards. The procedure, done by a surgeon under controlled conditions, was meant to remove a man from politics, not from the world. What happened to Constantine VI in the Porphyra was not what Paul of Aegina had described. Theophanes records the consequence without naming the technique. He says only that the cut was made with such violence, meta tosautes biaiotetos, that the emperor was meant to die from it. Zonaras, writing later and less sympathetic to Irene, is explicit. The order was for the blade to go deep. The basin of water Aetios carried, the small golden basin that has worried historians ever since, was for the surgeon to wash the blade between cuts. There were 2 cuts, the chroniclers indicate, 1 for each eye. The boy did not make it back to consciousness. He was carried from the room in a private litter, with the curtains drawn, to a smaller chamber elsewhere in the palace, where his second wife Theodote, Irene's lady, who had been kept apart from him for the previous 5 days under polite excuses, was permitted to see him. The chronicler does not give us their meeting. Theodote was 4 months pregnant with what would become the only legitimate male heir of the line, a boy who would be born in late December 797 and who would not survive his first year. The dynasty of the Isaurians, the line of Leo III, ended in that chamber. Constantine VI lingered. Sources disagree on how long. Theophanes implies death within hours. The patriarch Nikephoros, writing his breviarium some 20 years later, allows several days. Modern scholarship, Treadgold, Garland, and the more recent prosopographical work on the Isaurian court leans toward a death of between 4 and 10 days from septic infection of the orbital wounds. He was buried, without imperial honours, in the Church of St. Mary in Constantinople. His tomb has not survived. That is what the chronicle preserves. What the chronicle preserves around it is stranger. Theophanes writes, in one of the most quoted sentences of his Chronographia, that for 17 days the sun was darkened and gave forth no rays, so that ships went off their course at sea and ran aground, and all men declared that, because of the blinding of the emperor, the sun had withheld its rays. The sentence has been read three ways. Some early scholars took it as a solar eclipse. The modern astronomical tables show a partial eclipse on the 26th of August, 797, 11 days after the blinding, well inside the 17-day window Theophanes describes. But the eclipse itself ran a few hours, not days. A second reading sees a volcanic dust veil from a far-off eruption coinciding by chance. A third, more cautious, sees Theophanes reaching for the language of the Old Testament. The darkness over Egypt, the sun standing still, to register a moral horror he could not name directly. I lean toward the third. The monastery chronicler, writing of a woman he loved who had done a thing he could not defend, gives us a sky in place of a verdict. Irene was now sole ruler of the Roman Empire. She had been Augusta, she had been regent, she had been co-emperor for 7 years on her son's coinage. From the late summer of 797 forward, alongside the older feminine titles of Basilissa and Augusta that her chancery continued to use, she also signed certain decrees and struck certain coins with a title no woman before her had used in the Eastern Roman record. Basileus, the masculine ending, emperor alone. There are imperial documents and a small number of coins from these years that bear that signature, in particular in formulas addressed to the Western powers. Treadgold and Garland have discussed them at length, and the strangest of them begins with the formula, Irene, faithful Basileus of the Romans. Faithful Basileus in some documents, alongside faithful Basilissa in others. The chancery had to invent a grammar to write down what she was. She ruled for 5 years. They were not bad years. She lowered the urban tax. She opened grain stores during a famine in 799. She sent embassies to the Franks. The army was quiet because the iconoclast officers who had supported her son were dead or in monasteries. The monks were happy because the Council of 787 still held. The treasury was thinning because she was generous with the iconodule party that had brought her to power. But the empire did not break. It only changed shape. In the autumn of 800, on the 25th of December, in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne, king of the Franks, as emperor of the Romans. The coronation was, by every modern account that has been written since the 19th century, made politically possible by the fact that in Constantinople, in the view of the Roman Church and the Frankish court, the imperial throne was vacant. There was no emperor. A woman could not legally hold the throne in the Frankish reading of Roman law. The throne was empty. The dignity could therefore be transferred to a man who, by his deeds, deserved it. The historiographic dispute over this is sharp. The older reading held that the Frankish vacant throne argument was a pretext. The throne was held by Irene, plainly, and the Franks knew it. The newer reading, developed by Janet Nelson and others, is that the Frankish Church genuinely held the throne to be vacant under canon law principles of female rule, and that the coronation was therefore a legal act, not a usurpation. I lean toward Nelson, partly. The pretext was real. The legal argument was real too. Both things can be true. What is not in dispute is that the precedent of female imperial rule that Irene had created, that she had been forced to create by the choice she had made in the Porphyra, was, within 3 years, the lever that broke the western half of the imperial idea away from Constantinople and put it on the head of a Frankish king. She had made herself sole emperor. In doing so, she had broken the singular emperor into 2. She lost the throne in October 802. The conspiracy was led by her own logothete of the Genicon, the empire's chief financial officer, a quiet man also called Nikephoros, not the strategos of the Anatolics whom her son had been trying to reach in 797, but a different Nikephoros, the man we know to history as Nikephoros I, the same emperor who 8 years later would die in the Varbitsa Pass with his skull made into Crumb's drinking cup. The conspiracy moved against Irene in the small hours of the 31st of October, 802, while she was sleeping at the Eleutherius Palace. She did not resist. She was sent to a monastery on Lesbos. She lived less than 9 months in exile and died on the 9th of August, 803, almost exactly 6 years after her son had been brought into the Porphyra. The icons recognized her as a saint. The Greek Church does so to this day. The civil chroniclers, then and since, do not. The eunuch Aetios, the man who had carried the basin, was Patricios, strategos of 2 themes, and the most powerful man in the empire by 801. He had quarrelled bitterly with the other senior eunuch of the regime, Stauracius, the same logothete of the Dromos who had betrayed Constantine in the harbour in 797, over who would choose Irene's successor. When the financial officer Nikephoros made his move in October 802, both eunuchs were caught flat. Aetios was disgraced and exiled. Stauracius died of his old wounds the following winter. The men who had held the basin and held the doors did not outlive their empress by long. The chronicle preserves their offices and not their faces, and I think that is the appropriate justice. Theophanes did not want their names in his book any longer than he had to keep them there. The Isaurian dynasty was over. The throne passed to the financial officer, to Nikephoros, and from him, by the Bulgarian disaster, to the dynasty of Michael Rangabi, and from him in chaos through Leo V,